Hey y'all, I am Sam Machkovech, and I'm here with Analogue Pocket. I've been testing this for about 3 weeks through a big feature that just went live over at arstechnica.com. I strongly encourage you go check that out to get a lot of my thoughts and analysis and numbers and images and galleries about how this system works. But I thought I would rig up my cell phone in an echoey room and add a little bit of color and context to what I think about it and why I ultimately think it is worth its $219 price. It's actually going on sale, I want to say, in about 24 hours from when this video goes live on Tuesday, December 14th at 8 a.m. Pacific. And there are a lot of people who are interested in that because the first wave of these sold out in 2020, and then everyone was left wondering when it was going to ship and what it was going to be like. The good news is it's really good. Analogue Pocket, as you can read at Ars Technica, is an FPGA system, and there's a little logo at the bottom that will remind you of that every time you hold it. Field programmable gate array. You can go to Ars to see more breakdown of how that works, but ultimately it's hardware emulation. The guts of Analogue Pocket are designed to replicate original Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance hardware just out of the box by itself. And then you can add cartridge adapters to enable access to Game Gear, TurboGrafx, Atari Lynx, and Neo Geo Pocket. I believe Neo Geo Pocket Color as well. Only Game Gear adapters are currently available. I received one at the very last minute as I was doing all this, and I'm still kind of writing about my impressions of that. But the idea being, whatever physical real cartridge you put in, you will replicate that game exactly as it ran in Game Boy. With one big difference. The resolution of the screen, which is 3.5 inches, is 100 times, the resolution of an original Game Boy. 1600 or 1600 by 1440. As opposed to 160 by 144. So 10 times the pixels. Well, what does that do? So in my article, you'll see me go through different modes. This is just the straight up normal pixels. Completely blocky, no filtering, no tricks, blown up. But if I tap over one, it creates what's known as an LCD effect. This one is specifically the original Game Boy LCD, meaning a specific sickly green that truly compares favorably to the original Game Boy. But it's also every single white pixel is surrounded by a tiny, tiny 1 pixel wide border that's black. So pixel in this case is essentially a 9 by 9 square of tiny, tiny pixels, because again, 615 pixels per inch. That depth exceeds any Apple smartphone, even any Samsung smartphone. I believe Sony has a couple that go above 600 ppi. But that idea is you get this effect that looks and feels more like original Game Boy content, especially in terms of artist's intent, because sometimes you might have a wider field or even a blocky field that just makes more sense with that filter as opposed to just the clean pixels. And then you can even go one further and do just a grayscale, which I much prefer. You know, the green effect is fun for a second and then no thanks. Or you can even go to the Game Boy Light, which was the Japan-only kind of indigo color scheme. Or for fun, you can go to what is called Pinball Neon Matrix. I don't know that joke. I Googled it and haven't figured it out, but it definitely has a Virtual Boy thing going on. I don't recommend it. But here we are on my preferred LCD mode and on specifically original Game Boy hardware, not color or advance. You get those specific grayscale options. On Game Boy Color, you can simply pick between raw pixels or an LCD effect. Same exact resolution. I also prefer, with Game Boy Color, getting that LCD effect, even though it brings down the image brightness, because it's drawing so many more black lines. If you don't like that, or if you want to increase inherent battery life by just having those turned off, then you've got that as an option. Game Boy Advance has its own filter system, which resizes the pixels because it's not a perfect integer scaling when you take original Game Boy Advance resolution of 240 by 160 and translate it to 1600 by 1440. The good news there, because it's such a pixel dense screen, it multiplies by 6 2/3. And you would think with something like that, if you've ever blown up chunky pixels on a giant TV, you'll see more incorrect lines or even shimmering based on the imprecise pixelation either on a horizontal or vertical axis. But the beauty of Analogue Pocket is that this crisp display can have a Game Boy Advance LCD effect either enabled or disabled with horizontal and vertical or both scrolling on the screen, and everything looks crisp. I've yet to ever see an IPS display in modded Game Boy and Game Boy Advance units that looks that good. And original Game Boy and Game Boy Advance hardware is just full of ghosting and blurriness. You take an original Game Boy and the Super Mario Land attract mode, and you watch that just blur even without playing, and you see immediately that, yeah, it didn't age very well. Best you could do for an affordable LCD panel back in 1989. But this just absolutely beats the pants off of that. So getting on video just for me to say, really, that effect, that impact is unbelievable. So on top of that, I tested over 100 games, and I mostly leaned on flashcards for both Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. But went out to used shops, Pink Gorilla Games in Seattle, shout out, thank you, along with the Incredibly Strange Games Committee in Seattle. That's a group of folks who lent me a bunch of additional cartridges. So that meant testing curious side cases like Pokemon Pinball, which had a battery pack, or WarioWare Twisted. That one has an inherent motion sensor. Perfect Dark, which has a rumble pack. Yoshi Tilt and Tumble. I think that's the name of it. No, that's Kirby Tilt and Tumble. I was unable to test Kirby Tilt and Tumble, but I did review Yoshi Topsy Turvy. Point being, whatever weird stuff I put in, even Game Boy Printer and Game Boy Camera, everything I plugged in worked exactly as I expected. Anything that was slowing down was because it would do the same thing on my loaner Game Boy or Game Boy Advance system. Whatever inherent limitations are in original Game Boy software or Game Boy Advance software will be replicated on this based on the over 100 games I've tested. In the edge cases where I found any issues, I reached out directly to Analogue, the makers of the system, and they usually within 24 hours would say that's about to be fixed or it is fixed. And as of me recording this, every single issue I ran into was resolved by firmware updates, which were given and inserted in this micro SD slot. So that's the basic gist. Is color reproduction looks great, pixel reproduction looks great, no shimmering. It's just a really, really nice screen. Now, in terms of the system's expandability, we've got those cartridge adapters. I've only tested the Game Gear one just a little bit, about 7 games so far. All of them have worked without a hitch, although, again, they kind of reproduce the same slowdown chugginess that you get from original Game Gear hardware. And I wish I had more to say on that, but a lot less turnaround time on that. Built into the system, if you're not getting cartridge adapters, you've got 2 built-in tools. Nanoloop is your first, which lets you load custom music. It's a sequencer, and you go in using the original Game Boy buttons, select, start, BA, and D-pad, and tap away and create full loops that can be adjusted on the fly. You can just hold the Game Boy and pump out some beats. It's not for everyone. If you don't see the point of having the exact musical tone of something like an original Game Boy, crank up GarageBand on your laptop and take some old PCM samples and go to town. But for people who understand the FM audio sound that came out of an original Game Boy and really appreciate those specific sound waves, you're going to get identical stuff. Now, I tested using LSDJ, an album made on LSDJ by a musician named Remute. Hooked me up with a cartridge, and all of that sound reproduction was through the roof. Wonderful, impeccable sound, either through the 3.5 millimeter jack. I was able to, that's one option, either through headphones or through a higher end sound system. And if you decide to connect this to really nice headphones that have their own amplification, or to a sound system that's already amplified, you can change the impedance in the menus in order to reduce the potential of distortion and clipping as you go up to a higher volume level. So Nanoloop, I'm not an expert on that. It works exactly like the version that I could load if I downloaded the digital version and purchased that. That's for sale. So that's built in, that's part of the $220 cost. So if that's interesting to you, boom, it's ready to rock. GB Studio is a freeware handheld game creation system for Game Boy games. That's also a piece of software that I'm not necessarily familiar with, but I can load games that are loaded on that were made in it. And right here, I have a prototype of Dedius, which I believe was kickstarted in 2019. And it looks great, it runs great, and that's a .pocket file that I can just put on that same SD card I put the firmware on, and it just works. It runs. It's great. So those are all you have so far in terms of built-in tools. Unfortunately, you'll see a couple things that are grayed out here. Library and memories. These are going to come in a future Analogue OS update. The tentative window is January of 2022, which seems soon. I'll believe it when I see it. I will say that Analogue in general has been incredibly responsive and supportive, not just of this, but of home systems, TV systems such as Analogue and Super NT, Analogue Mega SG. So I don't doubt that they're pounding away on adding that functionality, but not live yet. And then from the setting side of things, you can go in on different systems from Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and Game Gear, and you can mostly, it's not a ton of options so far. Frame blending is the biggest. So let's say there is inherent flicker in software just as it ran on an original Game Boy or Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance has a lot of this, especially if you go through the classic NES series, where you start seeing the exact pixel scaling of NES resolution not matching up with the 240 by 160 of Game Boy Advance. Well, frame blending is there for you to undo that. It almost looks interlaced, the way that the pixels will kind of quiver back and forth. Frame blending fixes that. The catch being, you're going to get a little bit of shimmer in both horizontal and vertical scrolling when you enable frame blending. So you have to pick your poison at that point. When you're taking any Game Boy Advance software that has that inherent flicker of what looks like a interlaced video signal, like, would you rather have that, or would you have a little bit of shimmering in the scrolling of pixels? So you at least get that choice. Analogue doesn't fix one thing and break the other by default, so that's nice. You also get a sharpness setting, which honestly, I just set it to default. It all looks pretty much the same to me. Like, it doesn't change the size of the LCD effect on any of these. And then the biggest thing is in Game Boy Advance mode, you can change the size and position of the pixels. So if you don't like 6 2/3 multiplication of both axes, you can go in and add black bars to the top, bottom, and sides and have the exact 6 times resolution jump for Game Boy Advance. If that's what you want, go ahead. But I'll tell you, you're not going to notice much of a difference. Again, thanks to this pixel-rich signal. If you think you're going to be sensitive to it, just know it's there. So if you really don't think they can pull off a 6 2/3 amplification of pixels on both sides, okay, well then turn it off. That's your call. And other than that, though, there's not a lot of options. I forgot to mention, though, Super Game Boy mode is essentially a way to reassign on Game Boy and Game Boy Color, so that instead of putting your thumbs on B and A, you can put them on Y and B, which is effectively B and A. So meaning you can cradle your thumbs that way instead of using them like the original Game Boy or NES. If you like that, great. I think it's a great idea. I'm comfortable with that. Another option you have is on Game Boy mode, you can tell any cartridge to run as Game Boy instead of Game Boy Color. That's going to be a big deal if you have something like an EverDrive, because EverDrives, for classic non-advanced games, it just treats it like Game Boy Color by default because it can hold both kinds of ROMs. So if for any reason you have purchased an EverDrive and you want to put your collection of games onto one cart in the short term, before any jailbreak emerges or any other way to manage ROMs might happen, you want that force Game Boy in order to bring out that grayscale option, because if you load grayscale games in Game Boy Color mode, you can't change it to green and white or gray and white or indigo and white in those modes I showed you. Game Boy Color removes that because it just assumes you're in a wider color palette. So that's a whole lot of talking about sort of what you can and cannot do for now. Meaning, some stuff isn't here. The way that this screen is set up, you may not expect to add your own filters, your own scan lines, because that's not authentic to portable hardware. But if that's what you wanted to do with all these extra pixels, Analogue doesn't have any of that in the pipeline thus far. And if that's coming, I haven't heard about it. So either you're into the LCD filter, or you really like the blockier, non-filtered version, or that's it. Those are your options. And then I'd say the biggest consideration you might have, because I'm going on about just the use case, but what about the feel in the hands? How is it? Well, this is 276 grams, which the only Nintendo-made Game Boy product from the original to Game Boy Advance SP, none of them ever weighed more than 276 grams except for the original Game Boy with 4 AA batteries, which means this is pretty heavy. But not only that, the bulk of the weight is in this core here, is how it feels in the hand. All that weight kind of lands right there. But in normal use, it's fine. Just in terms of my adult hands, they fit very comfortably. I have room with 3 fingers on each side to brace it. Both of my thumbs fit comfortably. So for standard Game Boy and Game Boy Color fare, feels good. But the problem is when you try to brace it from above. So as you do this, you need to bring up fingers to brace the weight as it's kind of falling in, because otherwise it's just too heavy for simply your palms to do that trick. So if you like playing portable games while lying down and holding it up, whether you're on a couch or in bed, not great. But also, you can hear, this is me pressing those buttons. So if you ever had a design on silently playing in bed, this is not a silent button touch. The good news is it's very responsive. I love the feel of these buttons. I love the feel of the D-pad. The D-pad doesn't have any texture, but it doesn't slip off either, so long as I am holding it in normal mode. If you try to brace it this way without texture, your thumb is going to be more likely to slip, even if you have your fingers braced. So that's something to look out for. I really like the buttons. I've only had one friend who's tested this complain about the B and A buttons, since they are concave and not convex. If your preference is that every single button has a little divot for your thumb to go into, this might drive you nuts. Thankfully, there's Super Game Boy mode for Game Boy and Game Boy Color fare, so you can at least have one convex, one concave. But if that kind of issue, if that would drive you nuts, you should know that. I don't know how much of the weight has to do with the battery, but I do know, if you go to Ars Technica, you can see it's very easy to unscrew this backside. 1, 2, 3, 4, these are Torx T6 screws, and the whole thing flips up because these little buttons here for L and R are just, the whole mechanism is a micro switch that's beneath these. So this whole panel pops up, and there's a battery, you can just pop it right out. And there's one little battery connector, but it's very easy to replace. Analogue has made very clear that that was important to them. So thumbs up there, replaceable batteries are a big deal. In terms of the rest of the teardown, I can't say for sure. You can, if you look carefully, you can see that the glass slightly protrudes from the Analogue Pocket. So that, I like the feel of it, and I've yet to have any trouble with potentially dropping it or anything like that. But there is a tempered screen protector. I just got mine. I'm going to be putting it together after I end this video and get that ready for my accessory roundup, which is going to be up at ours later this week. But definitely, based on my use with it, I recommend it. I've actually taken to using the Analogue box and sliding Analogue in like so, because the top piece has little foam cutouts for the D-pad and the buttons and fits in snugly. That's been my carrying case. So they've yet to announce anything that is a traveling case that's somewhat malleable and that has sort of foam cutouts. Instead, there's a glass case. It's transparent and it's designed for showing your system off. I think it looks cool. I've seen it. I'll talk about it more later, but it is not a carrying case. So be prepared for that. Figure out a way to get this thing protected on the go when you throw it in a bag. The matte black finish, I'm a big fan. I don't see a lot of smudginess, even though you would think that it would collect finger oils. There's some of it. If I want to take a photo, I always give it a little wipe down. Same with the glass screen. If your finger just glances on it at all, you will get a fingerprint. But the whole body of it, it's not like a black smudging issue. I think the biggest issue so far is that there's been some scraping, slight scraping, that looks more like pressure than actual paint coming off. So I can see little lines since I've been pulling carts in and out for a while. Nothing that I would say is looks cheap or bad, but a thing you should be aware of. The biggest issue I currently have is the L and R buttons. These do not have a ton of travel, but there's the worst issue that unlike something like Game Boy Advance SP, which had the L and R buttons sort of on top in a similar shape, the cartridge is going to be in the way. You can't, because of how that is, it's really hard to comfortably get your fingers around in a way that's like this. You can see here it's kind of working, but it's not a full, comfortable, melt in your hands proposition the way the rest of the system is. The good news is when you're in Game Boy Advance mode, which is the only system thus far that has L and R support, you can turn Y and X into L and R. That is a toggle in the menus. Some games, that's going to be totally fine. Other games, it's going to feel weird. F-Zero, for example, if you want to use those shoulder buttons to nudge to the left and right, respectively, doing that with Y and X, it's not the same. I don't recommend it, but it's better than feeling like you're trapped with an L and R buttons you don't like. But I've come to believe that this is a matter of taste. I don't think that these are badly made. I think it's simply them doing the best with micro switches in this form factor, as opposed to going in a direction that looks like the original Game Boy Advance or PSP or PlayStation Vita, where the shoulders are spread out and the screen's in the middle of that. So not A+ rating there, but that's, I think, arguably my biggest nitpick. The weight and the L and R buttons might not be deal breakers, but they're definitely going to be things that you notice when you hold it and go, well, that's not the dreamy, perfect thing the way all the other stuff is. Everything else that I've thrown at this works and looks beautiful. Color reproduction is through the roof. The speakers sound really good. I totally forgot about that. I'm doing this without a script, by the way. You got these dots on each side that pump out sound. In fact, if I hit play cartridge and turn up the volume, we can hear it's clear enough. No distortion. If you get all the way to maximum in Game Boy mode, I've noticed there's some sound distortion. I'll go ahead and quit out of that. And Game Boy Advance actually has a menu toggle that lets you reduce the inherent noise, a little bit of hiss and crackling that Game Boy Advance games suffer with. So you can turn it off, and it's turned off by default. It's called high quality audio mode, but it's not going to expand the dynamic range of Game Boy Advance sound, and it's not going to improve usually the weak sample quality you're going to find on that PCM audio. But it definitely helps. It's definitely a nice touch to have. But the default sound for Game Boy and Game Boy Color just is meant to imitate those original sounds. So either you love that tone or you don't. So this has been me rambling for a while. Again, arstechnica.com for way more words, way more thoughts, way more deep dives, and me in the comments section answering any questions you have. Feel free to obviously comment here or find me on Twitter at SamRed. I'll talk to you there when I'm not busying myself with really enjoying Analogue Pocket. This is truly my favorite Game Boy-like hardware I've ever tested as compared to Android devices and as compared to modded original hardware. Obviously, if you have an old Game Boy or Game Boy Advance and you can pop stuff out and insert new screens or new buttons or anything like that, that's a pretty good idea. But if you're starting from scratch and you can order one of these and you like original Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, this is great, especially if you have cartridges. There's going to be expandability via cores for other systems, but this is all kind of hazy. Analogue is telling fans that the community will develop these cores and release them. So you'll have to download them and put them on your system. But how do you get the games on? Well, Analogue says they don't support anything other than original cartridges. So they're throwing out, and this is over at Ars Technica, the explanation is about having third-party cartridge adapters that you connect either to this or to the Analogue dock, which I've only begun testing. I'll have more on Analogue dock soon. So I guess you hope somebody makes a Super Nintendo cartridge adapter that's compatible with this, and then the community makes a core for the FPGA that simulates Super Nintendo on this. I feel like there's something weird missing there, and I think the thing that's missing is that people will figure out how to get ROMs on it one way or another. Analog isn't saying so in the meantime, and I can't test anything of the sort either. So that seems to be a wait and see thing, and prior analog systems have supported ROMs, which, by the way, that's a whole different conversation of how exactly you acquire your favorite digital games. You can currently go on Steam and get ROMs for certain classic systems in one way or another, or you can go on the internet and maybe find them another way. But that's a different conversation, and Analog is clearly being careful to not go in that direction because everything they do, especially the cores they build and the BIOS they use, is all their own work. It's not illegally taken from original Nintendo or Super Nintendo or Sega hardware. So they're playing that careful. I get it, but that's a weird thing to mind when you think about the expandability. Maybe this will support so many other game systems and support their ROMs, and it would be so simple to just take all of your favorite classic games, have them on the go on this gorgeous 3.5-inch screen. If not, and you just like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, and maybe the cartridge adapter games that have been announced, and you have those cartridges in one way or another, it's great. So those are my jumbled, rambling, echoey thoughts here while I'm on vacation. Thanks again for watching this. Again, I implore you, go check other sites that are talking about this, other YouTube channels, other hosts who have really worked their butts off. I've talked to a few of them on comparing a lot of different games, finding lots of test results, giving you great video footage. But I'm just basically here because I don't have to love this, and I'm a huge fan. And I'm really glad that I've had to play with it for a while and that I get to talk to you all about it. So again, Sam Machkovech, at SamRed on Twitter, arstechnica.com for my current feature-length review and more coverage coming later this week. Or comment here or in the article and we can talk. So thanks again.